So now we're going to switch to our test prep segment, all things ACT, SAT, potentially CLT, and soon to be UC standardized tests possibly. So with that, we're welcoming Scott Webster, who is our one of the Claiborne owners and is the director of our college entrance exam prep program. Welcome, Scott.
Glad to be here, Lee.
Well, Scott, there's so many questions I have for you, but why don't we start off with the most pressing and something that really shocked me. How do we navigate this June ACT that's still lingering around and has not been canceled?
I think we heard this theme throughout Rebecca's wonderful segment. But the old adage, right, is the only thing that is certain is uncertainty or change. So ACT is holding that line. To be fair to the ACT, it's an immensely complex process managing municipal test centers across the nation. So the short of it is we don't know. We have been hounding our students, parents, for any notifications, looking at other resources online. The short of it is we haven't heard anything for local test centers, and I assume that's the same in other municipalities. ACT has communicated that starting the week of the 26th, now they will notify each student through their ACT portal of any changes to their test centers. So recommendation there is just to actively check your student portal for any notifications.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Scott. You know, I think this is probably a tough one to answer, but one we need to answer anyway. There's so much uncertainty. Some colleges are not taking test scores. Some are going test optional. Is it worth it to do test prep or to prepare for any of these standardized tests?
I think that's an incredibly important question. It's a classic value proposition question. You have a finite amount of time and resources at your disposal. So what case can you make for a return on investment for preparing this summer, for example, prior to junior year or senior year as a high schooler to prepare for these tests? And the short of it is, as we've heard, there's a lot of uncertainty about some of the tried and true parameters by which students are measured in the application process. But one stick in the mud is standardized tests. So some schools indeed are de-emphasizing or temporarily removing admission requirements for standardized tests, but the vast majority of institutions still want that data. So the value proposition I would put to a student or to a parent thinking about test prep is these skills are pretty finite. They are relatively unchanged across both ACT, SAT. So if you can spend this summer developing that skill set and you can arrive either in July or August or September as the new school year unfolds, prepared to take these tests and you secure a strong score, then that's a clear return on your investment. Certain schools may de-emphasize it, but it's time well spent if you can check that box. I believe Rebecca, again, mentioned check the boxes you can now, and one of those is clearly the standardized testing one.
Yeah, and I guess maybe another element or another layer to that, Scott, is that, you know, perhaps increasing your score is not the only benefit to preparing for a standardized test this summer. If parents are looking for some structure that students can have this summer to continue their education, you know, what better than a test that's meant to cover multiple years of their education as a summary? And you know, again, maybe that's some sort of structure to provide this summer. And we've always talked about that there is other benefits to preparing for an ACT and SAT other than just the fact that that score will go up?
Certainly. In fact, when we communicate to families and students about the framework for prep and kind of best practices for prolonged study, it isn't an intensive process, but it is a consistent process. So that aligns very well with what you just mentioned. If each week you're spending 30 minutes a day honing your problem solving skills, improving your reading comprehension skills, mathematical reasoning skills, working grammar skills, that pays out dividends in other academic areas.
Well, so Herb asked a really great question, and it's a question we've probably heard time and time again. Um, what, in very simple terms, what are the differences between the SAT and the ACT? And could you tell what type of student would be a better fit for one test or the other merely by asking them some questions?
So not definitively, right? Because each student is individual, and at Claiborne, that is why we have a prolonged diagnostic and inquiry phase. However, in broad strokes, we can speak to similarities and differences between ACT and SAT. Fundamentally, they measure the same skill set. So that includes critical reading skills, as it pertains to multiple choice reasoning, which is bizarre but consistent in that format. Working knowledge of grammar conventions and testing a student's ability to identify those within context. And then mathematical reasoning skills, which include an ability to discern what mathematical properties are contained within a word problem, how to take a bunch of jumbled pieces in the problem and rearrange them to achieve an end. And I forgot data interpretation skills as it pertains to data and data representation. Big picture, we tell students frequently that the ACT is typically a little more straightforward, but at the cost of time, meaning it is a fast and furious test. 4 sections, 3.5 hours. It's the same approximate time as SAT, but the constraints they impose on students in the reading and science sections particularly just make it much more critical to navigate time well. So time management skills. If you feel strong in that area, maybe the ACT is good for you. SAT side, without going into the weeds here, is a slower and more methodical test, particularly in the critical reading section. So students may be drawn to the SAT if they have struggled historically with finishing assignments on time. Also, not to be remiss of the format of the 2 tests. If a student feels stronger in the STEM field and their mathematical abilities, SAT's composite score is comprised 50% of your math performance. So half of your score is math. Whereas on the ACT, it's only 25%, 1 of 4 sections. So that may draw a student to the SAT as well, if they feel better about their math abilities.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so it sounds like the summary there is that the structure of the test could lend parents and students to think that if you're stronger in math, you might get a higher composite on the SAT than the ACT. But there's so many other factors at play there that it's best to come to experts like Claiborne. It's obviously free to come through the inquiry process, to take the preference test, and to figure out which test is a better fit for you. And even during this time of a pandemic, there's many benefits to going through that process, taking the test, proving that you can finish that sort of project. And even if a school is test optional, there is certainly some benefit to submitting your score to them. In the absence of a just dire outcome on test day, you might be to your advantage to submit a score. So I guess a question that's been posed is Rebecca mentioned last week that SAT subject tests might be something that colleges are depending on to help distinguish students. What are some of the nuances in SAT subject tests, and how do they differ from the SAT, Scott?
Great question. It is on the top of our minds as standardized test performance possibly for the foreseeable future has greater weight. Standardized tests, subject tests are what they sound like. They are subject matter specific. And so the SAT broadly is a reasoning test. It measures a very broad range of content areas and specific skills. But if you're taking the SAT-2 subject test for literature or biology or mathematics 1, math 2, that is a measure of your content knowledge. Yes, there are strategies and skills necessary to navigate the subject tests in the way that there are for the SAT-1, but it's far more a measure of what you remember, your facility for that subject matter. And so this is why it matters more in a time of pandemic, because that is a way that you can communicate through a data point your subject matter knowledge, your expertise. And if that narrative aligns, say, physics, STEM, or literature, foreign language, that's something you can leverage in your admissions portfolio.
Great. And obviously we do help students prepare for SAT subject tests. Scott, what's the usual preparation time look like? We usually recommend for the full SAT at 16 weeks. What about subject tests? What does the prep time look like?
We should nuance this a little bit, because historically we are communicating with juniors towards the tail end of their second semester as they're wrapping up the year. And the reason for that is most students taking subject tests are planning to do so at the end of the year because they are taking subject tests in coursework that they are completing. So to clarify that maybe a bit, if you are taking AP physics, then it makes sense as you are studying and preparing for the AP physics exam to a couple weeks later take the physics subject test. So your study overlaps. We're in a place now where subject tests are perhaps viable outside of the normal semester calendar. And so that may stretch out prep, especially if it's been a while since you've actively studied the material. Overall, though, we would say it takes far fewer sessions to arrive at a place of competency or even excellence for subject tests. Typically 5 sessions to cover kind of the core concepts, and then to do a lot of independent work, take a practice test here and there. But I imagine that's going to fluctuate some depending on the individual student's circumstances.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that, Scott. I guess quick follow-up question. Do we know anything about the CLEP test, the CLEP offered by College Board, and what that's used for?
Great question. Again, this is not a newcomer to the testing arena, but it is one of the lesser known tests. Rebecca could probably speak better to this, perhaps in another segment, but it is, I believe, a course that aligns with subject matter knowledge, right, to measure your competency there. And you can secure college credit by taking these courses. I can't speak to the details because it's a little bit outside my wheelhouse, but it is a potential avenue for students this summer if they want, again, to communicate that growth narrative as a student, or to dive in deep to a particular subject area.
Great. Well, we have a great question from Graham. Graham, thanks so much for joining us. So Graham's asking about the order of the sections in the 2 tests and whether or not that should be a deciding factor, on the SAT and ACT. So Scott, maybe you could just remind us what the order of sections is on the two tests, and should that be a weighting factor in deciding between the two?
Certainly, yes. It's maybe a secondary factor that we often discuss with students, but certainly. So ACT sequence is section 1 English, so the easiest section, a nice way to ease into a 3.5-hour exam. Second section math, break. Third section reading, fourth section science. So big picture, that means that the time-constrained segments of the test that put the most pressure on students to manage their time well falls at the end of the test. So that's quite challenging. You're tired. Your analytical reasoning ability is stretched thin by that point. That might be a deciding factor. SAT throws prolonged critical reading at you first. So you wake up nice and early on test day, show up at the test center, and the first thing you're confronted with is a 65-minute reading comprehension exercise. That is daunting, but I suppose if you have to tackle that early, that might be better. It's followed by the writing and language section, which is the grammar section, and then math, no calculator, math with calculator. So math is at the tail end of SAT.
Yeah, and we talk a lot about test fatigue, Scott, and I guess this is the reason why we do individualized inquiry and diagnostic services, Graham, is because, because of the way the tests are scaled, depending on where you're trying to lie, you may want your strongest section to be first if you're looking in the 90th percentile, because every question could be the difference in 1 ACT point or 10 SAT points. Whereas if you're farther down on the 60 or 70 percentile, there's a little bit more variability. You can miss a question and still fall within the same score bracket. So there's, as Scott has mentioned, there's a lot of nuances to that. And so this is why we treat every student differently, because it really does depend on a case-by-case basis.
Indeed.
Dawn's commenting, thanking us for hosting these. Really appreciate you chiming in, Dawn. So Scott, I guess we would probably be remiss if we didn't mention this for our business partner. A couple of people have been asking about the CLT. What is this test? Where did it come from? And can we use it for college admissions?
Yeah, great question. Not to be confused with the BLT, though, one letter off. The CLT is the classical learning test. It's a relative newcomer to the testing stage, but it is gaining traction. It vaunts its test as a better holistic measure of student aptitude than what they perceive in the ACT and SAT to be a very narrow set of criteria for student performance. It is gaining traction, but it is still relatively small. It'll be intriguing to see whether more institutions do accept scores from the CLT as they start to norm that performance and understand what is a good CLT score. But if you're interested in details, you can go to their website and you can see some examples of their materials. Classical, of course, connoting the classical learning framework in which there's a lot of historical and rich literary history on the test. Go check it out. It's quite interesting, and it may be a contender in the future.
Yeah. I guess the only thing standing in its way, or one of the things standing in its way, is wide-scale adoption across universities. I think the last time I checked, there was maybe 200 schools that were on that, and you don't see a lot of the top-tier schools on that list yet. So again, we're excited about the possibility. Big announcement happened in the last week, and that was that the University of California says that they are going test blind in 2 years. But Scott, are they really? Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah. So the California system, of course, a trend setter for years, we know they've been skeptical of the merits of the standardized tests and the organizations, as the College Board and ACT for years. So this isn't super surprising. By going test blind, potentially, they are communicating that they will not look at your SAT or ACT scores, even if you got a perfect score. What they have communicated or are exploring is a proprietary test that they design. So conceivably, they aren't going test blind, they're making their own. So the strange little paradox there. It'll be, again, intriguing to see another test enter the arena. Will it be a better measure of candidates' aptitude? To be determined. I'm curious to see a practice test.
Yeah, and if we could speculate for a minute, I think that was the big part of the news was what's happening in the UC system. I know everybody was emailing and texting me and saying, "Oh my gosh, this massive university system is doing away with the SAT and ACT." And I think we had heard for maybe about a year now that they had been exploring options of changing their admissions, their application requirements, and potentially adding on. So the fact that they are exploring creating their own standardized test is not surprising. I wonder if, they hope to remove some of the socioeconomic bias that is inherent in the test. And I am excited about that possibility, though skeptical that you could ever fully accomplish that. Just because it seems like if someone has resources, they would likely always be able to prepare more for that test. So any speculation from your end about what the outcome of this would be? Would it fracture the test prep world? Would more schools start to adopt this? And how long do you think it would take to roll out and test a proprietary standardized test?
All great questions, and indeed it is speculation on our end. I agree with you, Lee, that it is in response to the perceived and real biases that are present in the current iterations of the SAT and the ACT. Those with will be able to prepare more effectively than those without. And so to that point, UC's test foreseeably can't avoid those challenges perfectly. They will face the same challenges that the CLT is currently facing, in that even I believe I read a 2-year release timeline when they are marshaling their resources and testing and scaling. They won't have sufficient data to scale these tests appropriately. It's going to take a significant effort and honestly just time for it to achieve wide scale adoption. So again, as is the case for so many elements in higher ed, to be determined. It does have the clout though. So CLT is trying to gain traction by securing endorsements from these institutions. The California system is a behemoth, so they may gain traction more readily.
Awesome. Well, Scott, that just about wraps us up. Deanna, thank you so much for chiming in. We're happy to provide this data. Scott, I'm going to just ask you one final question. Same thing I asked Rebecca. We obviously think having a practiced hand, a guide to walk through the test prep process is ideal. But what can parents use as resources in the absence of having a practice guide?
Excellent question. There's a lot of overlap here for test prep. Compared to college admissions counseling. So Prep Scholar has a blog that is specific to strategies for taking tests. Highly recommend that you check out those resources. Similarly, the main testing bodies, College Board and ACT, have free resources. Khan Academy partnering with College Board for SAT preparation, AP preparation, subject test prep, etc., CLEP. And then the ACT, I believe, partnering with Kaplan and their own proprietary ACT Academy. They've responded to the pandemic by offering these resources to students for free. So check it out. Go to their website. They're pretty robust.
Awesome. Well, Scott, thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to hearing more from you in a couple weeks.
Excellent. Thanks, Lee.
Okay, well, we want to thank everyone again for attending. We'll make this video available on our socials. We plan to have another event sometime in June, probably the 3rd or 4th week in June. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact us via our website, claiborne.com. You're welcome to call us, 434-295-4501. And of course, always ask your questions on social media. We have many of our staff members always watching for your comments. And from everyone here at Claiborne Test Prep and Tutoring, be safe and be well.